Welcome. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Today we're going to present a topic that I think you'll find not only engaging, but also this is critical in the workplace today. The litigation that is occurring, some of the psychodynamic damage that's being done is something that we all know of from childhood and going forward. Its manifestation in the workplace is not only devastating interpersonally, but also in terms of the impact on the business. Most HR folks are not deep enough in the research to see some of this work. Today you will. And it's a privilege today. My name is Dr. Michael Williams. I'm the Dean of the School of Business and Management at Thomas Edison State University in Trenton, New Jersey. And I am joined with my good friend and my good colleague, Dr. Joseph Youngblood, who is the Vice Provost and Charter Dean of the John S. Watson School of Public Service at Thomas Edison. To give you a very brief orientation, between us we have about a century of experience. But the idea of the academic orientation, the psychodynamic orientation, and also Dr. Youngblood is also an attorney. We bring a cogent and comprehensive orientation to a topic that most of you are impacted by every day. So with that in mind, let's move through a couple of boundaries that we see with workplace bullying. Workplace bullying is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. You get it from a comment that a colleague makes that is frankly insulting or somewhat nasty, if you will. Just the impact of that over time can be devastating. The question HR folks have to have is, what's the impact on the bottom line? It's psychologically toxic and disables workplace productivity. Think for a moment the last time that you've encountered bullying. In that second, you've had an opportunity to experience that, or you see it in the workplace. We'll show you some data around this that frankly may freeze you in your seat. The idea of the estimated cost to organizations, $200 billion. That's a nice number. I'd like to have that. Question is, would your organization like to have it back? In the 2012 Workplace Bullying Institute talks about, they had a study of 800 managers in 17 industries. And these are some of the data that were revealed. 48% intentionally decreased their work effort as a function of bullying. 63% lost time avoiding the offender on the job. Has that ever happened to you? Avoided somebody in the restroom, in the cafeteria, in the parking lot? And 78% reported that their commitment to their organization has declined. If you go around the exposition, you will see folks who are offering various kinds of software packages to enable folks to be engaged and motivated. Your investment can be absolutely annihilated with the context of workplace bullying. With that in mind, there are other kinds of things we have to consider with this brief orientation. Workplace bullying is likely to be the single most preventable and needless expense to your company's revenue source. That said, what's the context of bullying?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. We are the Men in Black, and this is how we co-facilitate these activities. So please do not be disturbed when you see us sort of engaging and popping across the stage. But Michael did a wonderful job of really setting the framework and the context for how we're going to deal with and address the issue of workplace bullying. It's really interesting. Our backgrounds are really sort of transdisciplinary. In addition, from my vantage point to being an anthropologist and a developmental psychologist, I'm also a lawyer. And of course, there are intersections with each of those disciplines with the topic that we're talking about. But what you won't hear me talk about in terms of the major framing today is the legal aspect of that. Why? Because at the end of the day, bullying is really about a cultural context that allows people, based on their perception of what is permissible in a workplace environment, to be able to engage in behavior that we know is inappropriate and, as the data demonstrated, outright destructive, both to the individuals but then also to the actual workplace environment. So what we wanted to talk about was this issue of the intersection of culture and context. Certainly as a lawyer, you can litigate certain aspects of this, but you can't litigate cultural change. So how, as a human resource professional, do you begin to think about how you can inject yourself into the workplace environment to make sure that you are not creating or exacerbating this culture that would allow bullying to take place. So when we talk about an ecosystem, we typically think about trickle down, right? But one of the challenges with bullying is that it strikes people right at the heart of their microsystem. Because I go into a workplace environment, I have a negative interaction with a colleague, it is happening face to face. It's not necessarily an organizational issue, which is how we typically start a conversation about ecosystems or ecology. So this imagery of the ripple effect is really important because we are right here at the heart of the ripple. And when we bully, it sends these ripple effects through the organization that then goes back up to the larger sort of construct of how we think about an ecosystem. That's why this is so important, that it has to be dealt with at the source. And again, that you're making sure that you're creating a culture that does not tolerate bullying. So 5 critical factors that I wanted you to take away in this part of our brief presentation. The first is that context matters. When is the bullying taking place? Who's engaged? What does that mean in terms of your role as a human resource professional? How is it that you are framing the context around the importance of addressing this issue, dealing with it both from a training and development perspective, but also in terms of a system of reward and punitive aspects when people are violating this common sort of understanding of what the workplace should be. Identity matters. Who is being bullied is always a critical factor in terms of how people construct their own notion of when and to what degree it's acceptable to engage in bullying. This issue of gender matters. Gender and context are absolutely critical. It's really interesting that you have a dynamic now where bullying is not just gender specific in terms of how we construct male bullying, right? There are female bullies. And at the end of the day, how that translates in terms of how the system responds and reacts to that is also very critical to creating this culture that allows for bullying to not be the context.
And Joe, if I can interject, the idea of gender in the aftermath of Orlando really comes into framing, and the idea of not only an existing culture, be it male or female, but the transgender and other kinds of cultures that are evident in the workplace. You are creating culture in vivo, actually creating culture every day. So these alternative cultures, if you will, then have to integrate with the mainstream cultures. This is highly complex, highly controversial, and you as HR professionals are in a position where you oftentimes don't have the knowledge, competence, or skills to deal with this. None of us do. Gender completely matters.
And number 4 here speaks both to culture in terms of the culture and ethos of the organization, but also in terms of culture, gender identity, ethnic identity, all of the factors that make us who we are individually as a part of how we broadly construct culture in the context of looking at bullying in the workplace. And then the 5th piece here is that relationships matter. So how, as a human resource professional, you're able to, again, be a part of the solution by building relationships, one, so that you understand what's happening on the ground, but that, again, you have the relationships that allow you to leverage the very professional orientation that you bring around these issues and mitigating them in the workplace. So I wanted to give you a brief model here to show how, in a classic ecological context, something that happens here has direct implications all throughout the organization. So if we look at the issue of bullying, what happens in terms of coworker dynamics has a critical impact on how you look at policies, how you look at procedures, how you look at your role as a human resource professional. It impacts every level of this sort of ecosystemic model that we're talking about when we look at social ecology. So the issue of making sure that at every level within the organization, there are policies, plans, procedures, and relationships that allow you to be able to create a culture that does not allow bullying to be acceptable, to have an immediate systems reaction, and again, to make sure that supports are provided is a critical part of the theoretical framework that we wanted you to have as you think about these issues in workplace bullying. This piece here, I think you'll find very interesting as an applied theoretical model to help you as a human resource professional to really understand, but then also have a clear sense of how you interject yourself into the process to change or transform a particular workplace culture. So for example, at the end of the day, as human beings, we all have varying levels of vulnerability and fragility. Your job as a human resource professional is to make sure that you're providing the protective barriers that don't allow people to experience the workplace in negative ways. Because as we go through this model, I'll skip ahead a minute, what we want organizationally is for productive outcomes for all of our employees and for the business. If you start at phase 1, and you are not balancing and providing the protective barriers, it means that people are really going to have to struggle with how they manage and deal with the stress that occurs because of anything that happens to them at the individual level. So let's use bullying as an example. If there is a bully in the workplace, everyone is potentially impacted at the microsystemic level. So when you think about the person who is the best friend of the person who's being bullied, they may not be being bullied by the bully, but they are impacted. So it, again, heightens the level of vulnerability that you have in the workplace. That becomes critical because as a human resource professional, if you have the relationships and you're on the ground, you can really start the process of intervening and mitigating the damages at level 1 in this process. Now, level 2 becomes really interesting because what we know in terms of human development is that if you are experiencing a risk, at the end of the day, there is a natural, normative human developmental response called stress to that. So a critical issue here in terms of why the protective barriers and your policies and procedures are so important, as well as rapid intervention when you know that bullying or an incident of bullying is taking place in the workplace. So what that means as a human resource professional is that you're trying to exert protective barriers, but then you need to make sure that the supports are commensurate to the challenges. So what that means for the woman in her workplace who is being bullied by a colleague, it's absolutely critical that there be an intervention, because what we know is that if the challenges that she's experiencing are not met with supports to mitigate it, then there's going to be a reactive coping strategy that's going to be deployed. And all human beings have 2 options. You either live or you don't. And when it comes to coping, you either respond more adaptively or more maladaptively. And typically what happens in this case is that what we think is the adaptive solution to bullying often is not. Because people think that the adaptive solution is just to say, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm not going to report this. I'm not going to take it to the next level because I think that's just going to create additional stress for me. Well, that's great in the short term, but the longer term implications in terms of what that means for the organization and for the people engaged, even the bullier, is a critical part of what I think perpetuates this cycle in these organizations that again erodes at the culture, that again is so important to make sure that we're dealing with. So what we know is that if people are positioned with supports to be able to respond more adaptively to issues like bullying in the workplace, then they are more prone to engage in positive workplace reactions that allow a much more stable and productive set of outcomes for the organization. So that becomes a critical framework to help you think about not just the issue itself, but again, how you, from a human resource professional perspective, really look at mitigating the damage when it occurs. So it's really a model that talks about risk, but also resiliency, which is really what you want for the organization. The article that we have in the HR magazine talks about the framework in that context in terms of how we look at this intersection of risk, reaction, and resilience, and that's really what this model provides. So we could go through a multiplicity of examples of how that plays out in terms of this risk model and the vulnerability model when there are supports in place. And that's the critical issue. What are the supports that we're providing to make sure that we're not sending a message that bullying is accepted in the culture of the organization? You can't litigate that, right? At the end of the day, you have to make sure that those supports are in place, and that's the piece that provides for the mitigation. So the last piece that I wanted to talk about diagrammatically here is that you also have to make sure that you're focusing on the root cause of the issues and not the system. So this model is a really interesting one that I think frames this in the traditional context, that oftentimes our natural reactive tendency is to look at the symptoms, right? So for example, here in a medical model, the symptoms that I'm exhibiting are that I am achy, weak, and tired. Well, if we stop there, we'll never get to the root cause of the issue. Certainly the fever begins to manifest and that becomes another visible piece, but we never get to really understand what's happening at the root causes. So when you look at the systems issues that allow for bullying to take place in a formal business setting where there should be accountability, there should be supervision, again, relationships should give you a key sense of what's happening in these organizations. All of those are critical aspects that allow you to dig down deep into the root cause so that the appropriate interventions can be scheduled, and proactively you can begin to look at training and development around these issues to make sure that they're addressed and that people understand what the important features of the culture are. And the last piece here, just to demonstrate again that this is about basic human development, and as long as organizations are comprised of human beings, there will always be this intersection between human development and organizational development. But at the end of the day, These last two phases of Maslow's hierarchy really begin to talk about the demotivating factors that prevent people from self-actualizing if these needs are not met. So if I am in an environment where bullying is a part of the culture, where I have seen people bullied, at the end of the day, it has a negative impact that again creates a level of disengagement that does not allow the organization to maximize its possibilities and also its resources. So making sure again that these two levels are absolutely a part of your framework in terms of training and development around bullying, the characteristics of bullies, but more importantly, how the policies at that larger macro level begin to impact how you look at that in the workplace. Those are critical elements that then allow your employees to really get the sense of belonging, to feel important, and again, to get to that highly engaged orientation, which from a human resource perspective, from a talent management perspective, are absolutely critical to driving productivity in the organization.
As we move these theoretical models to the actual application in practice, HR folks, most managers are in a position where they're called upon to do things they frankly have never done before relative to bullying. Some of the modeling that Dr. Youngblood has presented is unknown. So what do? Most folks walk around in the dark. They make legal mistakes, they make psychological mistakes, and practical mistakes that don't enable the business to act. So the idea is that from the genesis of bullying, using these frameworks and cascading them into the environment, one is bullying is a complex psychological condition. You'll see some of the work in this. Don't believe that you're in a position, one, to litigate it because you can't, but two, maybe not even understand the dynamics. This takes more advanced training to understand. You see the manifestation in practice, you make certain assumptions. Those assumptions can be devastating to you professionally as well as to the financial health of the organization. Psychodynamic influences. The cultural context, as Dr. Youngblood has referred to, context means everything. And if it's socially constructed, meaning we make it happen, you know it's very easy to have a conversation with a colleague, tell a story, and all of a sudden, it's reality. It's not reality. It's the social reality you've constructed. Bully by birth, there's in fact studies in genetic material relative to people having a predisposition by birth genetically to bully. And last, to Dr. Youngblood's point,
let me interject here because
Please.
I think this is a critical point. I think there are certainly things that create this genetic predisposition, but a large majority of the bullies are bullies because they've experienced success at bullying. So it's about identity development and concretization that at the end of the day, that's why the interventions are so important, because it is a classic normative developmental coping model to say that if I wake up on the left side of the bed every day for the last 40 years, that becomes a critical part of how I function. It's the same thing with the development of bullying and those skills, that once people experience success and that becomes their way of dealing with things and issues, that will become a predominant part of their identity and how they engage with colleagues, particularly when they feel they're at a disadvantage.
And to that point, that reinforcement is socially constructed, which is in fact maladaptive. You bring that in the neighborhood into the workplace, there is no difference. So expect what you get, which is maladaptive behavior. And to Dr. Youngblood's point, social context, allowance, acceptance, it becomes normative. You accept it. So you become the enabler of the bully. So, some idea of how you define workplace bullying. It goes by many names. This is what the Workplace Bullying Institute talks about. Repeated mistreatment, sabotage by others that prevent work from getting done, verbal abuse, threatening content, intimidation, humiliation, and if I gave you a magic marker, you could continue this definition. It has many faces. So, bullying behaviors, self-loathing. How many people talk about self-loathing in the workplace? You don't. The idea of self-loathing, these are much more complex. Fragile self-esteem, insatiable need for attention. This is narcissistic personality disorder. To Dr. Youngblood's point, the only way that you can get a handle on some of these and understand is understanding the deeper psychological context. Hence the diagram of the tree and the causes. That's how you understand, but you can't know this by just knowing it. You need further training to be able to understand.
And this issue is important as well because there is a predatory aspect to bullying. I mean, it's the same in a different developmental context for 6-year-olds as it is for 60-year-olds. That at the end of the day, people have their own framework of the people who are more susceptible to being bullied. So at the end of the day, that aspect of this predatory orientation of identifying the people in the workplace who are more likely to be susceptible to it is still a critical part of the 30-year-old bully's orientation around who she can bully. So a critical fact to remember.
And those
there.
orientations come through life. They come in our personal lives, professional lives, and in organizations. So you start to sew these together, and you see bullies, some of the behaviors, rageful behaviors. Is anybody here rageful? Rageful behaviors, you know how it feels, what it looks like. And the idea of self-hatred manifesting in others. Oftentimes the normative explanation for bullies is they are aggressive towards others. They're really aggressive towards themselves. So, these are the things that you already know that we've highlighted. It threatens organizational growth, it erodes employee commitment, and often the employers are just as bad as the employees. So let's take a quick look at that. Some of the statistics and data for you is that not responding to bullies, and to Dr. Youngblood's point, especially around the social context, the bullying idea, if an employer doesn't address it or even recognize it, they're just as guilty. So, 66 million workers report being bullied. That's a whole lot of workers. The idea that you can see the numbers, bullied victims, losses of job, forced out or fired, fear of employee retaliation. And HR folks typically find themselves coming into this term where it becomes a legal solution when in fact it is not. That may be an unfortunate yield. Yes, Dr. Youngblood?
Absolutely.
So, these are some of the data you may want to look. We move forward. Well, the reform issue, if you'll notice the presentation, and oh, by the way, in the bags that you have, Dr. Youngblood and myself wrote this article. This is in this month's HRE magazine, which you can get from HRE. We have copies of it up here on the front if you'd like. It's also in the bag. If you'd like signed copies, we're more than happy to do that. You can go over to the Thomas Edison State University booth, which is right over there. We'll be happy to sign them for you. However, when you look at the demise of bullying, the idea of rage, which is bullying at self-loathing best, the reform issue, and now we get to this idea of the demise of bullying. So fact, unlike other forms of workplace bullying, bullying is not deemed illegal federally by federal and state legislation. Isn't that crazy? We have workplace discrimination, we have all kinds of things, but bullying's okay. How can that be? We take a look at the American Bar Association, and Dr. Youngblood is an attorney and a member. 26 states have introduced anti-bullying bills. However, none of the bills have been passed. How can that be? Yet our organizations are suffering upwards of $2 billion worth of productivity loss. That's a big payday.
And the issue is that because it is such a dynamic issue, but typically when we think about bullying, we think about what age group? We think about children, right? And so we forget the developmental translation of how that plays out for adults. So maybe the issue is about nomenclature, but again, as we talk about, going and speaking with legislators to get them to understand the impact on the bottom line that this issue has, it's the same thing, and we have to deal with it in the appropriate developmental context. And I think that's the big issue in terms of why we haven't seen any degrees of success in terms of, wholesale sort of legislative change to make sure that we're dealing with and that we have legislation to address bullying in the workplace.
We felt this topic was very appropriate, being in Washington, D.C., the seat of power and legislation in America, right down the block. Federal legislation about bullying has not occurred. It's time to talk to your representatives. So, with that in mind, some calls to action for HR professionals. This is not new to you. At the same time, you may be in positions where, because it is complex, it is chaotic and also unfamiliar. You know what it looks like and feels like and sounds like, but what do I really do? A couple of things. Dr. Youngblood had mentioned the zero tolerance policy. It's a place to start. It isn't the answer, but the idea is if you know it and see it, what do you do? Some ideas. Building a business case to eradicate bullying. HR professionals need to have a business and legal background enough to be able to make a business case. If you're unable to make a business case, it may be an opinion. That will get you just so far. So you need to partner with people who are able to make a business case for you if you can't do it. Employee awareness of programs, sometimes these will come through EAPs. A clear and actionable anti-bullying policies, which many of you are already involved in. However, at this point, my colleague, Dr. Youngblood, or folks like him who have both a legal context as well as a developmental context can give you very intimate intersection points which can really support the organization relative to these kinds of activities and how to best address them. And last, employee-centered resources and supports, which focuses back on Dr. Youngblood when he's talking about having the appropriate supports in the 5-part model to make adaptive and productive choices.
And all four of these options are framed in proactivity. At the end of the day, I go back to the illustration of the oak tree. If you can see the limbs on the tree, the roots are already so developed and the issue is so dynamic that being able to deal with that only in the reactive context is never going to effectively eradicate the issue. Those four strategies are really about addressing the root causes and making sure that you are proactively treating and tilling the soil to make sure that there are positive plants and vegetation that's growing in the system.
And let's not be deceived by this. This is not easy stuff. If you anticipate or assume that you can do it alone, you really can't. And that's where, frankly, you could get yourself into some significant difficulty without having access to the appropriate professional. Don't take this monster on by yourself. So having a psychological understanding, a developmental understanding, a legal understanding, a management understanding are critical components to a broader strategy, which I think needs to be embraced by senior management.
Right.
So we're almost done, and we move forward to the very end, folks. We'd like to give you this idea that workplace bullying presents a clear and present danger. It's getting larger. It's not getting smaller. It's getting larger because it's becoming revealed. It's always been there. It depends on what face you put on it. So it's there. So to organizational productivity and sustainability, there's another article we have, you'll see, that talks about mental illness and organizational productivity and sustainability, which you might find interesting. And adopting the mantra of workplace bullying is bad for business. It's bad for business, it's bad for you, it's bad for everybody. And the idea of driving profitability and growth, if it's bad, it's not going to happen. So with that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank you for participation today. You can stop by booth 2549, which is right over there, or we invite you to come and speak with us today. We have some articles for you, happy to sign or at least give them to you, and speak about any concerns you might have. It's been absolutely a pleasure and a privilege as always, Dr. Youngblood.
Same, thank you. Thank you.
And folks, enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.